Welcome, welcome everyone. Welcome on in. Welcome on in. Thank you so much for joining us for our very first session of Feminist Night School today. Welcome on in. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Share your pronouns, where you're joining from, what you're hoping to learn tonight. In our first session, we're going to be talking about the state of protest. My name is Amanda Chavez Barnes. I'm Senior Director of Programs here at Women's March. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. And feel free to say hi and introduce yourself in the chat. Pronouns, name, where you're joining from, what you're hoping to learn this evening. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes, just waiting for folks to get connected here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Wisconsin in the house. Yes, Pennsylvania. Hello. Thanks for being here, y'all. I know we had quite a few people sign up and let us know that they want to catch the recording. And that's totally fine. But we really, really appreciate y'all who are joining live. Please share this link to any of your friends and networks of people who might be able to join live with us so that we can have a really robust conversation and engage tonight for our discussion. We have some amazing guest speakers, experts to share about protest, the work of protest itself, and also defending protesters. So thank you so much for being here. Again, my name is Amanda Chavez Barnes, Senior Director of Programs at Women's March. This is a webinar, so you won't be able to unmute yourself and you won't be on camera, so don't worry about how you look. It's all good. You will be able to engage in a few different ways. If you're like me and you just updated your Zoom client on your computer, it looks a little different, but don't freak out. It's pretty much the same. You have the chat all the way to the right. And that's where we encourage you to, give comments, connect with each other. If somebody says something that resonates with you or mentions that they're in an area that's geographically close to you or is working on similar work as you, please feel free to reach out to them directly. And also feel free to use the react buttons. There's a little heart in the middle of the bottom panel if you've updated your client. If you haven't updated it yet, I think it looks more like a smiley face. If you click on the react, then you can, do heart or clap, etc. So if the spirit moves you while someone's speaking, yeah, thanks for the reacts. Feel free to click those buttons. Let us know how you're feeling, what's resonating. And we also have the Q&A enabled. So if you look at the bottom, it looks like a question mark icon. And if you have questions, we'll answer those at the end for the most part. If it makes sense, I might incorporate those into the conversation, but please drop your questions into the Q&A so that we can find those later, because oftentimes questions get lost in the chat. So with that said, I want to go ahead and kind of kick us off tonight. So again, if you are just joining, my name is Amanda Chavez Barnes, Senior Director of Programs at Women's March. I'm based in Atlanta. Very honored to be joined today by our speakers. I'm going to go ahead and read their bios and introduce them to you, and then give them opportunity to share more about themselves. So first we have Celeste Faison, who's co-executive director of the Movement for Black Lives, a national network of over 150 organizations creating a broad political home for Black people to learn, organize, and take action. Now, previously, Celeste served as the director of campaigns at National Domestic Workers Alliance, and she's also co-founder of the Blackout Collective. A seasoned organizer, she cut her teeth as a youth organizer in 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement and served as lead organizer at Youth Together. An organizing strategist, Celeste served as assistant director of the League of Young Voters, training thousands of young people in new electoral organizing strategies that infused community organizing, Many of those methods were actually adopted by the Democratic Party in 2008. So Celeste has been breaking ground and paving the way, y'all. And during her time as director of the Rucker Society, Celeste fell in love with direct action. And in 2014, she co-founded the Blackout Collective, an all-Black direct action collective that assisted with shutting down the BART and the topless Say Her Name action. Iconic. Um, and she spends her free time traveling the country, developing Black people as direct action trainers and strategists. And we are so honored to have her here today. So please give a virtual round of applause and warm welcome to Celeste. And we also have Suad Abdel, and she's the First Amendment Fellow at the Southern Center for Human Rights, where she coordinates the First Amendment Lawyer Bridge Project. And within this role, she's building out the Southern Center for Human Rights mass defense infrastructure to support protesters in Atlanta. So we are so grateful that she is taking her time out to join us today. Suad earned her JD from Loyola School of Law in New Orleans, Louisiana. She's devoted her legal career to advancing the rights of communities facing security state abuse and repression. Suad has worked with Palestine Legal, supporting activists fighting for Palestinian liberation and advising human rights advocates on free speech violations. And with the Center for Constitutional Rights and Project South on issues surrounding surveillance, mass incarceration, and corporate obligations under international human rights law. Before her role at SCHR, Suad served as the Leonard Weinglass Fellow for the National Lawyers Guild, working to support activists and organizers in the Atlanta area. So we couldn't be more grateful to have Suad join us today as well. And I'm going to go ahead and pivot us to the discussion portion. And kicking that off, I actually wanted to ask first Suad and then Celeste, if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself. We heard your really impressive bios, but if you could just share, in your own words, your experience and history with protest, as well as your current work. And from your unique vantage point at this moment, how do you see the state of protest movements and our human right to protest here in the US?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So honored to be joined by Celeste, very, very big fan and really, really admire your work. So honored to be on a panel with you and here with the Women's March. My name is Suad Abdel. I am the First Amendment Fellow at the Southern Center for Human Rights. My background, I come from Sudan and I'm a refugee from Sudan. And actually, my father was a political dissident in Sudan. So I think I got introduced and we actually first moved to Egypt and then found refuge from Egypt to here in the United States due to his persecution in Sudan. And so this idea of protest and state repression against protest is coming from a background of being deeply affected by state repression and coming from a place in which protest, people bring their kiffins, their like the thing. It's kind of this robe that you're buried in. People when they go to protest in Sudan, you bring your kiffin. So you're understanding that you may die in this protest. So coming from that environment is the importance of and kind of seeing now an extremely destabilized Sudan and totally repressed, due to an authoritarian militia. I think really it emphasizes the importance of having of an open society in which citizens can protest the unjust laws and inequality that they're experiencing. So I guess coming from this background, a lot of my background during law school has been in supporting Palestinian solidarity protesters and activists, and the Palestinian solidarity or the movement for Palestinian liberation has long been criminalized and in really extreme manners. And so that really gave me this foundation of working with activists facing extreme penalties for the kind of work that they were doing. And coming from there, moved here to Atlanta, and worked a lot initially with the referendum efforts here, and wanted to support the criminalized activists. I guess maybe I can share a little about the state of repression in Atlanta, if folks are not familiar. There is they're calling it a training facility, Cop City. I'm sure folks in this call have heard of it. This training facility, which is really a facility to militarize police, has been extremely opposed by many Atlantans and many across the nation, because it is being used as a model for militarization facilities all across the nation. So protesters against this facility, which they're calling, call within the Stop Cop City movement, are vast and is this decentralized movement of many different coalitions, those working for indigenous rights. This is an environmental justice. This is facility is being built on a the facility is being built on a land which is belonging to the Walani people, and also a forest, so the trees are being taken down. It's also there's also a water source that is being degraded because of the construction of the facility, and so there raises many environmental concerns, as well as policing abolitionist, anarchist groups, and those concerned with the ways in which policing is causing violence in our communities, are extremely concerned with this facility being built. And I think rightfully so. This is a facility that is, I'm sorry to be so long-winded, I was giving background, but I can go into that, the kind of militarization aspect of
No, you are totally fine. It's really great to hear all that background, especially like talking about like your personal experience and like what, why protest and this like freedom of expression is so important to you. And then also specifically the work in Atlanta. I'm based in Atlanta. We have folks in the chat who are also in Georgia. But for folks who don't know what Cop City is, it is this project, to build a huge like surveillance and really just ramping up again the militarization of the police in the city of Atlanta, where many unhoused people have been displaced, and these sort of services are instead, the money for those services is being allocated to increased police militarization. So we're really grateful for the protest movement and also for folks like you, Suad. So yeah, if you just wanted to share a little bit about like what you were saying, your current perspective, like what do you feel like is the state of protest in the U.S. from where you?
Yeah, and then so just to continue a little, from the Cop City protests, there were those who occupied the forest, who sat in the trees in order to prevent the trees from being bulldozed. Environmental activists, the police, members of the Atlanta police force came in and shot one of these activist Rutagita, and in that aftermath of brutalization and killing of a protester, folks protested. Within that march, people were arrested and charged with domestic terrorism for their protest efforts. Within the following month, there was a week of action in which protesters continued to protest the building of the facility, as well as the killing of Tortuguita. Within that protest, everyone was rounded up, everyone that they could get, and many within that group, especially out of state, individuals that did not have Georgia IDs, were charged with RICO, racketeering, so federal racketeering, a major felony, and domestic terrorism. So additional individuals were charged with domestic terrorism. And so this decision by the Attorney General's office to prosecute individuals protesting with, and many could say, in all the right types of protests that they were doing. Like, one person charged with domestic terrorism and racketeering was a legal observer. He was an attorney that was simply legal observing there, and he is currently actively being prosecuted for these federal crimes. And so this trend of prosecuting and charging protesters with extreme penalties is used to deter and chill further protesting efforts, further organizing efforts, and I think is being, a lot of prosecutors around the nation are replicating a lot of these tactics, trying to use federal laws like FARA and others to criminalize activists for their protest work. So I think this is kind of showing what a lot of Cop City activists were advocating against all this time, is that this is going to be used as a model elsewhere around the nation, the ways in which policing is being being militarized. Policing is becoming increasingly violent and brutal, is being exported around the nation, and really Atlanta is being used as a model. And so I think this, yeah, I'll end there. So I'm so sorry, Celeste, to take up so much intro time.
No, you're good. Thank you so much, Suad. I really appreciate you giving that really thorough context. It is hard for folks who are not, who are not here in Atlanta to understand all the intricacies, but everything you said is really important. So thank you for sharing. And Celeste, same question to you. If you could just share a little bit more about your history. Obviously, you've been deeply involved in protest, direct action, and for a long time. And just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience and your current work, and from your vantage point, what do you see as far as the state of protest?
Mm-hmm. Hey, welcome everybody. Peace, peace, peace. My name is Celeste. My pronouns are she, her. For those using accessibility, I am a Black woman with braids and a black shirt, and some big old silver earrings. And that really represents where I'm from. Born and raised in Harlem, New York City, which is really important to my lineage and my relationship to not just protests, but to movement, right? I think it's really important that we do not devoid protests from strategy, and that and protests from action. When we have these conversations about do we have the right to protest which is a tactic, right? We have to remember that that tactic is a part of a set of strategies towards us getting free, right? And so it's really not a question about do we have a right to protest. The question is, do we have a right to seek freedom? And the answer to that will always unequivocally be yes, right? And so my folks, many of the folks that my ancestors were brought here through chattel slavery. And the rights that we've acquired in the United States have never been because we've asked politely. They've always been hard fought, wins that have involved the sacrifice of our ability to take care of ourselves, We've put our lives on the line in order to get basic things like the end of slavery, to get things like the right to vote, desegregated schools, um, the right for women to participate in democracy. All of those things actually come from protests, and those protests were a part of a larger strategy to move two things, right? When we organize, we want to move people and power, which I like to say people and resources, towards our side, right? And protest has been a way to do that. I want to ground us in this quote that Frederick Douglass offers, which is, and Frederick Douglass was, if you don't know, a powerful abolitionist and a beautiful writer and journalist. Um, and and he says, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to win favor, freedom, and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want ocean without the awful roar of many waters. This struggle may be a moral one or a physical one, or one where both moral and physical, that may be both moral and physical, but it must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will, right? And I really think that really speaks to the lineage of Black people in America and how we've had to fight for a democracy that continues to not fight for us, right? And fight to be able to participate and preserve some basic rights. This question around the state of protests is actually a funny one, right? And it's not one posed by us, and we should be clear about that. Those who are oppressed, those who experience poverty and oppression, it is our instinctual right to crave freedom and to take to the streets and by any means necessary obtain that freedom. And a lot of us choose to do that through nonviolent protest, right? This question around, is protest effective? What is the right way to protest? What is nonviolent? What is violent? What is, how important is property? All of those are actually questions that have been proposed by our opposition, proposed by the right in an effort to undermine the legitimacy of people standing up to have a voice, right? And so I just want to like really contextualize the debate here, because it's not one, we move with clarity, right? For instance, I come from an organization, I'm co-executive director at Movement for Black Lives. We are a configuration of over 150 organizations, and we were birthed out of the Ferguson uprisings. During that time in 2014, we were the next generation of a long lineage of protest and organizing. And we came together um, because so many of us across the country were taking action, right? We're on the streets, we're protesting. And then we saw many iterations of that from 2014, 2016, and 2020, right? And there's always this question from our opposition and from the petty bourgeoisie, which is like those who look like us, but like don't really represent us, right? Who are always raising this question, what is respectable protest, right? And I think we really have to investigate that, because I've never met anyone with power who said, "Thank you for making me feel really comfortable. I will meet your demand," right? It's in that uncomfortability. It's in it's in the way that we take the streets. It's in our unapologetic nature in which we take protests that forces people to answer this moral question that Frederick Douglass spoke to, which is, which side are you on? Are you on the side of justice? Are you not? And that question has to be an agitational question. This question around the state of protest is only raised because protest has been effective. If protest over the last, and they raised this question in the 1960s when one of the quotes is like, our Negroes are happy, they're complacent. And so their protest can't be from them. It has to be outside agitators. They're not capable of that, right? And they know how to behave. And actually, it was domestic workers, it was bus drivers, it was Black women who said, forget respectability, right? We are going to we're going to protest. And it wasn't until the media had an eye and got on a protest, particularly the Selma to Montgomery March on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where we could see that the that we that my lineage was protesting in actually nonviolent ways, and the state was reacting in violent ways that was agitating and escalating, right? And we see that now, is that we can look at the protests that are happening all across the country around Gaza, that are happening at college campuses. Those protests are largely peaceful, but when you bring the police in, who are there to violently protect the state and resources, and to agitate, right? When you bring those folks in and they're escalating, right? Then the question never is, what is the state of how police respond to protests, which is the real question we need to answer here, right? How are our rights being encroached upon? And as protest becomes more and more effective, from the civil rights movement to Ferguson, to the demands to defund or the demands to divest in Gaza, we see um, we see our right to protest, our freedom to assembly, our freedom of speech be taken away. And this is not the first time. This is what has happened historically. So the state of protest, I would say, is that protest is moving. And if it wasn't moving, and if it wasn't powerful, if it wasn't the right tactic, they would not be attacking it. And so we have to be really vigilant to both continue to fight for the issues that we are protesting for, and to fight for our rights. Because when we to protest, because when we don't, we are allowing for and seeing the spread of fascism and authoritarianism in our communities. And simply put, is that we're seeing the erosion of our ability to participate in democracy and have less and less people of color, less and less poor folks, less and less of the working class be able to decide how we get to govern ourselves. So this right to protest is not just about our right to be on the streets. It's about how we envision democracy being upheld in this country. And so I'll end this question with saying, with two quotes from one of my favorites, which is Bayard Rustin, even though, he had a controversial end child. First is, when an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him, right? And he has another related quote to that, which is, protest is not only transforms your target, it transforms you. as someone who has not had an experience with power, in that moment of protest, you are directly demanding and seizing power and confronting power. And that's very transformational and important for folks in our community to experience that. And the last thing, which was the impetus of why we founded the Blackout Collective, is Bayard Rustin's quote. We need in every bay and community a group of angelic troublemakers. And so it's really important that we protect our rights to be those angelic protesters, to ensure that the next generation, 7 generations, have those rights and are not fighting for the same thing 7 generations later.
Thank you so much, Celeste, for those gems. Thanks both of y'all for helping us get this kicked off in a really powerful and deep way. We've already touched on sort of a lot of the things that I was wanting to ask y'all. In particular, I was planning to really go into that question of like, you know, how damaging is it? You've already touched on it. How damaging is it when, people try to draw these lines based on respectability of who's a good protester and who's a bad protester? And why do we have to say nonviolent protest? It's because our opposition is trying to associate protest with violence, right? And so when we, Women's March say protest, we're using that as shorthand to talk about the right to peaceful assembly, the right to expression. But really, like you were saying, Celeste, it's a tactic used in a social movement struggle. And like you're mentioning, the word struggle, our foremother, Barbara Smith, says, it's called a struggle because it's not easy. Don't call it a struggle because it's easy. And it's a tactic in the struggle for freedom. So thank you so much for really grounding us in that, and illuminating that. And along this line of, so many people, and we unfortunately are hearing folks who, would like to say that they're on the side of change, really echoing some talking points that are rooted in fascism, that are trying to vilify protesters and really justify the criminalization and violent repression of protesters. And one of the really common attacks that I've seen from people looking to vilify protesters is, oh, if they're not doing anything wrong, if they're not planning violence, why do they have their faces covered? And it seems to me like either people are very uninformed, or there's a collective amnesia around the well-documented use of surveillance against protesters historically, as well as recently. Like you're mentioning, Suad, the protesters against Cop City in the forest, and particularly thinking of, recently surveillance programs of Black organizers and activists and protesters in the movement for Black Lives. So just wondering if y'all could speak a little bit to not only, we've touched on a little bit the violent militarized police response, but also the surveillance, and the entire sort of state apparatus that has been built up over years, and the history of protesters needing to protect ourselves whenever we're engaging in this struggle and using these tactics.
So I think something to understand particularly with facial recognition technology, is that when protesters' facial data is collected with this technology, this data can then be added to pre-existing watch lists. It can be compared to other your facial data from all over the internet. It can be added to the many databases. It could be used to create a new database of people who attend protests for future matching and identification. So I think many people who want to maintain their anonymity and not. Also, this data can be sold to third parties. If those people who want to maintain anonymity and not have their facial data utilized in these extremely vast networks, want to do so by covering their face, I think it's well in their right to do so. And I think it speaks to this idea that we've been talking about like it's this Black, brown, and Muslim protesters are seen as inherently violent and are criminalized as such, even when they're undertaking nonviolent protests. And so innocuous things like wearing a face mask, like although many others do it, is seen even as a criminal activity or some sort of suspicious activity in those cases. And I think that's that stigma should be removed. And I think people have a right to privacy, especially with their with such sensitive data.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I would just add a couple of things. So one, the state has always used surveillance as a means of intimidation. And uses surveillance, and there's a fine line. I'm in New York City, so if you heard that siren. So there's a fine line between the way that the state uses surveillance to enact violence and the way that the state uses surveillance to empower vigilante violence, right? So both of those things are true. So I'll give you an example of that, right? Historically, so I lived in Selma, Alabama for a long time, and we had the same mayor from 1960 to 2000. His name was Joe Smitherman. In 2000, we ran a campaign called Joe Gotta Go. And being a mayor for 40 years, he used surveillance to create state and municipal apparatuses to spy on organizers, right? And most of those folks, like the sheriff and all of those, were legit KKK members that met every Friday next door to the Voting Rights Museum at the Masonic Temple. And so what we saw was similar to January 6th, is that we saw folks that were both were blurring the lines between private citizenship and being state actors, and using that power to intimidate organizers. So you would see that back in the day, if Ku Klux Klan members were members of the police force, in 2000, we would see sheriff folks, they would have their high beams on and have them their high beams pointed towards our living room all night for weeks at a time to intimidate us. They also planted car bombs and other such things, and some of my mentors. Um, and then so you have like this thing around how the state is not only using surveillance to create how the state uses surveillance to promote and protect vigilante violence. In 2014 to 2020, we saw the state and media post pictures of protesters, and then that information be used to dox protesters. And vigilantes would organize themselves on 4chan and 8chan, using the information that the state provided, and also created databases of activists with all their personal information, to create targets that to target activists that were utilized both by private vigilante groups and the state. The other thing that surveillance does is that it criminalizes our right to protest and the organizers themselves. So we're seeing more organizers across the country be hit with RICO charges and other federal charges. And that they're using like literal videos and pictures. They're surveilling if you make a Facebook post or an IG post or a TikTok to say that you are the conspirator that is then responsible for thousands of people feeling empowered to take the streets. And they're trying to single out specific actors and to charge them with that. And so we're seeing more and more of that happen, and the ways that they're doing that is through surveillance, not only during the protest, but of our personal pages in our social media. So we have to be really careful and have good security practices when you're putting protests together. Movement for Black Lives offers security trainings, and there are other really great collectives that offer that kind of security training so that we can prevent the state from surveilling our folks and making them more vulnerable. But we also have to pass laws limiting the abilities of the state to surveil us, right? And we have to pass laws that not only limit the ability of the state to surveil us, but we have to be vigilant ourselves in our practices to ensure that we're not giving the state the kinds of information that they need. And there's really simple ways of doing that by using encrypted means and all of that kind of stuff. Um, Using encrypted apps, turning off your phone, not taking your phones because they're doing things like tracking where um your your location and saying like if 5 different activists were in this location at the same time, they can use that to build a conspiracy case, like really outlandish things. And so we have to be not only fight, but we have to be vigilant in our practices around that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Um, wow, there's like so much. I'm trying to think, where should we go next? But honestly, so many of the things that I was thinking about, would be great to touch on. You've gone not only, responded to those, but have gone even deeper. And so I really thank you for that, for taking this conversation to another level, both of you. Um, and, a couple of the other things that I was thinking to talk about, which has already been addressed, is really the state violence and militarized police response against protesters. Um, and as I was thinking about these questions, I was remembering back in 2018. So last, I'm sure you remember, in Georgia, we were engaged in electoral work. And the thing about it is, of course, sometimes in our protests, recently Women's March, we did a direct action at Supreme Court and we planned to get arrested. And so sometimes we'll do civil disobedience where we plan to get arrested. But increasingly, um, we're just getting snatched up by the police. And I mentioned the 2018 example because here in Georgia, the Georgia state capitol, all we were doing was we had a group of folks led by Black women demanding that every vote be counted in the governor's election, right? And the police just came in and started snatching folks up. I remember at the time, my 4-year-old daughter, I have twins, so they'd be Zoom bombing me sometimes, sorry. But my 4-year-old daughter was saying, they arrested my friend's mom. And they arrested one of our state representatives who, was just standing, not even really participating in the protest. And so we're seeing the police really respond so aggressively and incredibly violently, as heartbreakingly, you're mentioning about Tortuguita was really executed. When all was said and done, originally they tried to say that he was armed, and of course they tried to vilify him and say that he was an aggressor. But when the autopsy was done and it was shown that he was shot 57 times, it's pretty clear that excessive use of force doesn't even begin to describe the type of militarization and the types of state violence we're seeing enacted against protesters. So one of the things that people are increasingly afraid of whenever we're putting out calls for actions for people to attend is not only state violence but political violence from our opposition as well, especially in the wake of January 6th, and people seeing, that folks, are on, who are part of our opposition, really are not afraid to take it all the way there in terms of escalating to full-on fascism. And so I'm curious, or would just love to hear y'all's thoughts on that and how we can continue to keep each other safe and continue to, move forward in the struggle, knowing that, these are times of increasing, threats of state violence and political violence in general.
So I think one thing that we have to be so careful about in our responses to white supremacist violence is in fact equipping the state with more ability to oppress us and repress us. So one example of that is the domestic terrorism law here that is now criminalizing Black, Brown, Indigenous, and anti-policing activists. Was created and it was created in response to a white supremacist attack on a church here in Georgia, and so and this is common terrorism, counterterrorism laws that are then used against Black and Brown people historically are rooted in rhetoric around fighting white supremacists and white nationalist violence, but then is then used against the very people that those white supremacists attack. I think so. Just the framework of counterterrorism, we have to be extremely careful around. Celeste brought up the example of Frederick Douglass. People who are considered radical in the time of their protests. Later, they are praised as, history shows us that they were fighting a divine fight. Frederick Douglass was supportive of abolitionist movements, including militant abolitionist movements. In this time, he would be charged, persecuted as a terrorist. I think this is really, we have to be so careful about this label of counterterrorism, about pushing for counterterrorism policies in response to white supremacist violence and expanding the state's ability to persecute and prosecute us. Just as well, anti-riot laws, many have roots in combating white supremacists and then are later used and are now in 2020 onward were used really prevalently against protesters. And just on the note of again, Black, Brown, and Muslim people being seen as inherently violent, you hear all the student protest faculty everywhere, tenured faculty doing sit-ins, undertaking extremely mundane, nonviolent activities, are brutalized. Here in Emory, they were brutalized, criminalized, and extremely penalized for their actions. I think another thing about the militarization I just want to hit on is about the fear of Cop City. So the fear is because people are looking around and saying, why are cops in this wake of people asking for racial justice creating an urban warfare facility? What are they preparing for? What kind of violence are police in this country trying to undertake against protesters? Even here in Cop City, they call it themselves within the facility Little Gaza. They're using Israeli tactics here, and they're trading equipment, trading strategies to use against civilian populations in urban centers. I think that's extremely troubling. And this concept is being shipped all over the nation. There are many Cop City facilities now popping up all over. So people have I think an extremely a fear and concern against this, against what is happening, and kind of the rising authoritarianism that comes with this. And we must act against it with the same force that we're presented with.
Mm-hmm. I think you covered it. Can you restate the question? I don't know if I have anything to answer to add to the brilliance.
No, yeah. I'm just like, what can we do? Like, how can we, just continue to be in the struggle and keep each other safe in the face of, the real, people have justified fears and concerns about state violence and political violence from our opposition.
Mhm. Yeah. So I want to lift up a couple of resources. So you can reach out to Movement for Black Lives, if you want some security training. And that's personal security, digital security, and some organizational security. And specifically, if you are a Black-led organization, we can help you think through like the how to integrate that in all levels of your infrastructure, right? So hit us up and for that. The other place that's a really good resource is Center for Third World Organizing, has some really great security trainings and partners with lots of security collectives and labs. And they have two programs in their organization. One is the Ruckus Society, which has been doing direct action now. They came out of the Seattle protests. I'm smiling because I love those comrades. And the Blackout Collective, which we founded during a protest in Ferguson on fluorescent. Um, so use those resources, right? And as you're planning your direct action, really thinking about security culture at all times. This conversation could be scary, but one of my mentors, Gopal, always says that if it's our right, then we have every right to do it. And so I just want to bring that into the space because all of these conversations around the criminalization of protests could discourage you from doing it. And that is the point, is to discourage you and to repress. And it's really important that we continue to utilize our and use our basic rights and the tools that we have to have voice. So that's some of the other things that you can do. Um, and then from Cop City, like my comrade said, is really we're seeing the expansion of military forces both abroad and domestically, right? And abroad, we're seeing those pop up as regional wars. And domestically, we're seeing those pop up state by state, right? So they don't look like coordinated efforts, but there's actually close to 63 proposed cop cities in cities across the United States right now, right? And all of that is to um, further militarize our communities. Um, and so this fight is not just about our right to protest. I have to keep regrounding us that we are really fighting fascism and authoritarianism, y'all. And that doesn't belong to either the Republicans or the Democrats. It's on both sides, and some of the sides are even more so committed than others. And so we really do have to engage in these upcoming elections, not because one candidate is better than the other, but really because we need to choose our opponent, who we're going to contend with, who we're going to negotiate with. And and those opponents, although they do have some similarities, differ in some ways. And so engaging in this upcoming election is going to be really important. And I don't mean that on some corny, it's the year to vote. Like, if we are going to continue to protect our basic rights to organize, to gather, to have public voice, if we're going to fight criminalization of our folks, then we have to do that. And then the other thing I just want to say, and just to have like a really real moment, is I was doing an interview earlier today about this young man in Florida. He was 23 years old, a senior officer in the Army. And the cops the other day knocked on his door. It was the wrong door. He had in Florida, in a stand your ground state where you can have a gun, he had a gun pointed down and he answered the door with one hand up, one gun pointed to the ground. That's what was on the body camera. And the police executed him right away and then told him to drop his gun. And as he was dying, he said, the gun is not in my hand anymore and I can't breathe. And so while there's some things that we can do to protect ourselves, we also have to remember and operate with this understanding that our color, our Blackness, our gender are seen as inherent threats to the system, are always going to be interpreted as violence, right? And so when Black and brown folks take action, there's a higher level of risk because our mere presence is a challenge, right? Our mere presence is seen as violence. Our right to breathe and gather is seen as violence. And so if you're not Black and you're on, or not of color and you're on the call, or really thinking about how you're using your privilege and your bodies to protect the most vulnerable folks when you're out on the streets, right? What positions are you playing in protests? How are you challenging the conversations around who is deemed as seen as violent and who is not, right? How are you engaging with those in that conversation? And not only having that conversation with those who are oppositional to you, like on social media and politicians, but to really ensure that you're having those conversations with the folks in your families, right? With the folks in your communities, and doing the work and starting it there as allies so that you are helping to create a safer environment for the folks that are on the streets. And so that's another action you can take. So again, reach out to us, there's Women's March has some of those resources. Reach out to Center for Third World Organizing. Don't forget to vote so we can choose our opponent and who we're negotiating with, and have those conversations starting at home with that annoying racist uncle you do not want to be at Thanksgiving around, right? Start to have those conversations around who is seen as violent and who is not, and then put your body on the line when it comes to protests in safe ways on behalf of the most oppressed communities.
Thank you so much, Celeste, for your powerful words. And again, I'm so honored to be on this call with you. I'm so honored for all of you that have stuck around. I just want to make a call to action to donate directly to criminalized activists in Atlanta who are facing much of the brunt of state repression against protesters. You can do that by visiting FALB Project, FALBproject.org/give. And that goes directly to the Legal Defense Fund. That doesn't go to any nonprofit overhead. It's directly to the funds that will provide the legal representation for protesters. To learn more about the First Amendment Lawyer Bridge Project and about mass defense in Atlanta, you can visit our website, falbproject.org. For resources, I just want to uplift again, the M4BL resources, really, really thorough on just so many different elements of protest. Also, the National Lawyers Guild Mass Defense resources, they have like medic training and digital security training and all of that as well. There's also this link I wanted to share on, because we touched briefly on the Cop City facilities, they're calling cop cities, militarization facilities that are really unprecedented and really distinct from the training facilities that we've seen decades earlier. So the research on tracking around all of the COP city militarization facilities that have been built all over the nation. So you can see if one is being built near you, using that resource. I thank you all again for watching, and thank you so much for having me, Women's March.
Thank you so much to both of you. We really appreciate it. And we'll be sure to email this out, recording out. Please do check out the resources. We'll include those in the email as well. Have a great night. Thank you so much. And we're still here. We're glad to be in the struggle for freedom together with y'all.
Thanks, comrades. Keep it going.
Good night, y'all. Bye.